have this ongoing joke with my friends when I talk about I didn't know I was queer until I had a girlfriend. And for a while, I'm not going to hold you. That's also what I I believed in that for a long time. And this is my second time recording this. I recorded it halfway last summer, 2 summers ago, the summer before last. The summer before last, I recorded this and I was going back to watch the videos. And one of the things that I said either in my interview or when I was interviewing Kaylin was me being queer very much caught me off guard. I feel like I was out here flirting, got called on it, and then next thing you know, I was in a relationship. Since then, reflecting on that conversation and reflecting on me growing up, that's not quite true. Not quite true at all. Because when I think about my journal entries from elementary school, when I think about a lot of the spicy thoughts that I had leading up to that, it was never giving straight. It was never giving straight. And it's very funny to reflect on that and to look back at that and thinking about that whole experience, right? Because I also think about if religion wasn't a part of my life at all, would I have come to that realization? Would I have come to that realization quicker, you know? And what would that have looked like? When I did have a full realization that I was queer, when I was in my first same sex relationship, it was a very challenging time for me because at that point, I knew everything that I'd been taught growing up about queer folks. I know what the conversations were often like about queer folks in the church. I've heard people say some wild things. I even heard people say that the people of New Orleans deserved Hurricane Katrina because of all of the sodomy that was going on in that state, right? I've heard people say some really disgusting things about queer folks. And then I was sitting with the reality of like what I felt, right? And it wasn't anything that I went looking for. It wasn't anything that I went searching for. It wasn't anything that I chose. It's one of those things that happen organically. And when it happened, I was like, this is cool. This is pretty cool. And it was genuinely a hard thing to juggle because queer folks come up often in the church, right? And so it's like I'm genuinely having a good time. I am enjoying the exploring. I'm enjoying the relationship. It's tail end of high school into college for me. So just such a wonderful time of just like self exploration that was hard, but that I really enjoyed looking back on it and I'm very grateful for. And also, I had fun. I had fun. But it's also mirrored by the reality that every week I was sitting in a church and in a pulpit that did not acknowledge my existence, that constantly referred to my existence as being shameful, constantly demonizing the attraction that exists, and the constant conversation is you're going to burn forever in the lake of fire. It's always fascinating to me how church folks then and even now try to distance themselves from their bigotry. Well, they'll say some egregiously homophobic, transphobic, bigoted things, but they then believe or act as if their saving grace is, oh well, I didn't say it, I didn't write it. That's what this says. That's what God said, right? And it's like this distancing that happens that was always just incredibly ridiculous to me. And what was even more challenging to sit with, and now moving past that, I just find it to be more infuriating, is the number of people. There are certain sins in the church. There are certain things that are interpreted as sin in the church that will get all the screen time. It's going to be anything related to queer folks, and it's going to be abortion. Those are always the issues where people, even if they've never stepped foot in a church, they still hold on to some of those religious beliefs. Those are usually going to be the two issues that you get them on. And what was fascinating is that as someone who went to that church from the time I was 2 up until the time that I left, that was mid 20s, there were people in there. If you want to talk about sin, it was some sinning going on there. You had, I experienced men who were old enough to be my father, grandfather, and even just men who were older than me, who were legal when I was still in elementary school, high school, who were actively pursuing and harassing me. Men old enough to be my father and even at times my grandfather. And even if they were closer in age and not necessarily old enough to be my father, they were absolutely legal adults when I was still a minor who were actively pursuing a child, right? And that's disgusting. But that doesn't get the screen time. That's not what gets people's panties in a bunch. That's not what upsets people. Queer folks, it's always that, right? And it's wild how many folks, even outside of like people who were genuinely predators in the church, I'm then thinking about how many people were openly fornicating, people who are adulterating, people who are adulterating at the church, which is wild to me. And so it's wild that you have people who would be in the thick of their sin that harms other people, right? Whether it's minors, whether it's a person that you committed your life to, whatever that looks like. Straight up sinning in ways that are genuinely harmful and traumatic to other people, but yet fix their lips to say where queer folks should or should not be doing. And that is wild to me. And it's even wilder once I left the church and I realized how many people were fully aware of the type of people who existed in the church, how many people were fully aware of what was happening within the church, did nothing and said nothing, and will still go back every week. Wild to me. A lot of the harm and discrimination, a lot of the harm I experienced within the church as a queer person oftentimes was through commentary and conversation that would either come up in the sermons or would come up in private conversations with folks. And so, as someone who has been going to church or went to that church from the time I was 2 up until the time that I left, and I had a parent who was deeply involved in the church, was on a number of committees, I spent a lot of time hanging out with church folks. And I spent a lot of time just being at church around grown folks, having grown folks conversation. And I might not have said anything as a child who had to stay in a child's place, but there were just a lot of comments that I heard made by people in the church that were genuinely just very disgusting, right? So even going back to one of the things that I heard is people talking about how the people of New Orleans deserved Hurricane Katrina because of all of the sodomy that was going on. When people are talking about HIV, and I'm someone who has worked in HIV and case management for several years in queer health, sexual health, the number of comments I've heard about people, the number of times I've heard someone talk about HIV being a punishment sent by God specifically for queer folks is wild. And what's terrifying about that is that as someone who has worked in HIV, as someone who is doing the intakes with people coming into the program, how often that comes up and how often that stigma and those comments and those conversations lead to people not accessing care when they need it, or lead to people navigating their diagnoses by themselves because they don't feel comfortable sharing it with other people. And it's such a wild thing to reflect on and experience just how comfortable and open people are with those things, with saying those things and genuinely believing those things, and then trying to distance themselves from the really messed up things that they say by then being like, oh, well, I didn't say it. Oh, it's in the book. And how often people would weaponize scripture to justify the harm. If I'm being honest, to keep it a buck, I never had an official coming out. And it wasn't a, oh, I'm actively in the closet. I feel like when I was in my first relationship, first same sex relationship, there was some hiding in a sense of, okay, if my family's around, I'm not going to do the kissing, I'm not going to do the holding hands. But I would I was still bringing that person around. They still came to my house. I'm still talking about them. I'm not saying it's romantic, but I'm not talking about things that we've done together or conversations that we had together. Y'all might not see it, and I'm not confirming anything or denying anything, but that person was still coming around, still hanging out, still met my family, still came to my graduation. And once I was in college, I didn't really put any effort into hiding things. Once I graduated college, especially once I was on my own and moved out, there really wasn't anything to hide. I was talking about it on Facebook, and I never had like an official coming out like, here I am, but I also wasn't hiding anything, still not hiding anything. I talk about it very openly on my social media platforms, when it comes to the work that I do and conversations with people on social media. So I never had a this is who I am type moment. I just one day just started talking about things more and more publicly, and